Father Simon, you're a forgiving bunch of folk. Early in our marriage, we invited my husband's parents over for Sunday lunch. This was a major undertaking for me because my mother-in-law had never liked me and criticised my attempts at wifely duties at every opportunity. I was determined to give her a meal she couldn't criticise. For moral support, I invited my sister and her boyfriend, and the cost of the roast for the 6 of us was extortionate. In fact, it cost about half of my weekly shopping budget. I had chosen a really superb piece of Scottish beef. This was in the days when you could buy beef on the bone, and inexperienced as I was, I asked my butcher to bone the joint for me. He happily obliged, it was really expensive, and gave me a few tips on roasting the joint to make it even more delicious. How's it going so far then, Nigel?
Yeah, very good. And I like it on the bones, but she's taking it off. But there you go.
On the Sunday morning, I meticulously prepared the meat for roasting and spent ages shaping the roast potatoes and carrots, making them as professional as possible. I baked an actual apple pie for dessert and made my own custard from scratch. Everything was looking great. The roast was browning beautifully. When my sister arrived, I felt relaxed enough to join her in a glass of wine. You'll all now think that I got squiffy and burnt the dinner, but believe me, it's much worse than that. The joint was at the point where it needed to come out of the oven to rest for 20 minutes, and I'd carefully placed it on the kitchen table under foil to keep warm when the doorbell rang. It was my in-laws. My new husband, my sister and her boyfriend were in the back garden with the dogs, 2 border terriers. My husband obviously couldn't hear me call, and I was calling him to go and answer the door, but he didn't budge. So leaving my cooking and wiping my hands on my apron, I went to let the in-laws in. My mother-in-law was frosty. She'd waited a good minute and a half. I'd answered the door, and she clearly didn't like the dress that I was wearing or my haircut, or indeed the fact that I was alive. Her first words were, "Where's Paul?" as if I'd tied him up and hidden him in the cellar. Luckily at this point, the other guests and my husband came in from the garden. Coats were taken and wine was poured. After a couple of minutes, I excused myself to go back to the cooking. When I got back into the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was shredded tin foil over the floor, and for a second I was baffled until I realised that the roast was missing. Horrified, I looked out to the kitchen window where my 2 dogs, as you might have guessed, were running around the garden with the joint in their mouths, pulling at it like a rag doll between them.
Animals.
Well, they are.
Yeah.
I mean,
I know.
Dog-like behaviour. In a matter of seconds, I was in the garden trying to catch them to take the joint away from them, but because I couldn't shout at them, as everyone indoors would have heard, I was frantically whispering threats and supplications as they romped around with my very expensive dinner in their jaws, believing they were engaged in a huge game with the added benefit of something very yummy at the end of it. Eventually, I managed to get hold of them and extricate the meat from their mouths. As I carried it back into the kitchen, I patted down the bits where they had chewed and wiped off some of the dirt, the grass, and dog snark, says Ginger. I'm not sure of that phrase.
Yeah.
What?
Well, I think we know what it is, don't we?
I think we know what it is. It's a nice phrase. I haven't heard it before. I had just put the joint back into the roasting tin, chewed side down, when my mother-in-law walked in, obviously looking for something to sneer at. She commented on the size and obvious quality of the meat, and by now in a state of almost total nervous collapse, I whittled on almost hysterically about how very expensive it was. I'd bought it from the very best butcher. Now the butcher had very kindly boned the joint and given me tips for cooking it. She sniffed and warned me that the proof would be in the eating. Well, members of the confessional, the meal, I have to tell you, was an outstanding success, to such a degree that my mother-in-law was almost powerless to criticise. Everyone, except her, commented on how beautiful the meal looked, how crisp and flavoursome the vegetables were, and how mouth-wateringly tender the joint was. I regaled everyone again, by this time I was a little squiffy with relief, with the story of the best cut of meat, the best butcher, and how kind he was to bone my choice of joint. It was an absolute triumph, right up to the point where my mother-in-law, wincing, pulled a small piece of meat from her mouth and peered at it and announced, delightedly, "Well, your butcher can't be that good. Look, he's left a sliver of bone in." Well, it made her day, says Ginger. However, I don't ask forgiveness for the crime of serving meat which I had pulled from the slavering jaws of 2 dogs. No one knew. Everyone enjoyed it. No, if possible, all these years later, I'd like to apologise for the damage done to the reputation of the man who boned my beef, because he really hadn't left a sliver in there at all. What my mother-in-law failed to realise, and which almost gave me total heart attack that day, as she held it up for everyone to see, was that the sliver of bone she found in her beef wasn't a sliver of bone at all. It was a tooth from one of the dogs.
Oh, what?
Who had been enjoying her meal before she had.
Oh, dear.
Imagine if she'd found out. My word, it would have been carnage in the kitchen. It's Ginger. So it's a familiar tale. We've had joints being stolen by the dogs before, but they've never left their teeth behind. What do you say?
That was a nasty twist in the end, wasn't it?
Nasty twist, nicely done, Ginger.
The mother-in-law sounds pretty horrendous, but actually I blame the husband, because she did call the husband, didn't she, and say, you know, can you come and answer the door, please?
He was busy.
And he was in the garden having a nice drink with with her sister and her boyfriend, and couldn't be bothered to open the door.
Yeah.
So she had no choice.
As the doorbell went.
Exactly.
No. Stop that again, please.
Any excuse.
Anyway, the husband should have gone to answer the door, in which case this would not be an issue at all. So I blame him. I don't blame Ginger. And I think, you know, I feel sorry for the butcher, but I don't think it would have had any impact on his business, because it doesn't sound like the mother-in-law went shopping there anyway. So you are forgiven, Ginger.
Mother Superior.
See, would you stop that?
Would you just go to...
Yeah, can you...
Okay,
do you
I'll
need
do it.
help?
I'm making the food, and I'll also answer the door. It's
You
fine.
see, I was really sympathetic with Ginger for a very long time, until the dogs got the meat and she just wiped it off and stuck it back in the oven. I think that's unforgivable.
We'd all do the
I
same.
think. Well, no, I wouldn't do the same. I'd
you
sound
wouldn't cook the meat.
no, well, I wouldn't, but I would.